Golden West by J.R. Murdock. Season 1, Episode 3. Sitting in the restaurant alone brought Abigail looks from many passers-by, not just because she sipped her coffee from a cup like a lady, but because of her determined stare. Mr. Lamone had somehow sneaked up on her while she sat on the train. She wasn't going to allow it to happen again. Quite the contrary, she knew he would find her again, and this time she wouldn't be taken by surprise. On the table next to her coffee cup, she'd set the tiny disk he'd left for her at the table, and the strip of fabric. He had some explaining to do, starting with why he'd invaded their privacy. Oddly, her father hadn't complained about any of his things being out of sorts. Only her butterfly seemed to have been tampered with. It was likely that her father hadn't noticed anything, because he'd been busy with his new toy. She took another sip from her coffee. While she waited, she figured she'd have something to eat. For just a moment, her head turned away from the table. "Don't order food from here. Let's go somewhere else." Mr. Lamone sat across from her. She tried not to jerk her head in his direction, but it was impossible not to. "I've got a bone to pick with you. Explain this." She pointed to the table where the disk sat. The piece of material from Mr. Lamone's suit was missing. "I left you that. Please, put it away. You'll find use for it later. Please, could we go somewhere else? We must talk about the work your father is going to do." She picked up the disk and placed it in her sash. She then lifted the coffee cup and finished the last sips before she got to the dregs at the bottom. Trying to look casual, she moved the saucer, looking for the piece of fabric. She had to hand it to him. He was a quick one. Without a doubt, she'd have to keep an eye on him. It wasn't so much that his sudden appearance frightened her, but more the way he couldn't stop looking around as if someone was out to get him. "I passed under the cafe up the street. It looks as if the food might be acceptable." Abigail placed a nickel on the table. Very good. Just not here." She waited until they were on the street to ask, "What's wrong with that place?" "I just didn't get a good feeling in there. You understand. Ever since I started trying to contact your father—" "You've been trying to speak to my father as well?" "Well, I wanted to, but I had seen you first. Now I'm afraid if I speak to your father he'll get quite upset. Moreover, I think he'll be even more determined to head out to California than he is now. He mustn't go. You've said that before, and you started with a story about ghosts. I'm a sensible girl. Ghosts are nothing more than stories about fairies or trolls well, you know." "Miss, I'm sorry if we got off on the wrong foot back in New York. I didn't mean to frighten you." She stopped in front of a store to look at a dress. Even though it looked exquisite, she had no desire to walk any further. Something about Mr. Lamone reminded her of her mother, and the more he spoke of ghosts only strengthened that feeling. She took a moment to wipe a tear from her eyes. "Please, Miss Chamsky, shall we have a bite to eat?" "I don't think I'm hungry right now. I've got some shopping to do. If my father and I are headed to California, I just realized that my wardrobe is most inappropriate for the wild. A girl like you doesn't belong in the West, and neither does a man like your father." "Help me find some proper attire, then. I don't want to talk about this right now." "I know you are waiting for me. I know you want to talk. Don't start acting like this doesn't interest you. Your father is important to you. I can tell. It won't take long, and once we have a more private place to speak—" Mr. Lamone looked up and down the street and pulled his jacket nearly closed. Abigail wondered if his suit ever fit properly. She regained her composure, smoothed out her dress, and turned back to face him. "Mr. Lamone, I expect a complete explanation. No more disappearing, no more vague references. You're right. I knew you would find me once the train stopped. So let's go so I can get some answers." A buggy rounded the corner so fast that it went up on 2 wheels. The driver pulled hard to rein in the horses, but the buggy continued to tilt and nearly went over. The cloud of dust behind it sprayed up from the road and hung in the air, causing passer-bys to cough and choke. "I wonder what that could be about?" she asked, and turned back around from the excitement. Once again the man had disappeared. For a moment she thought she might find another disk at her feet, but instead, just the wooden walkway. "Looks like I'll go clothes shopping after all." Shaking her head, Abigail entered the clothier. The clatter of the fork on his plate brought Reginald's attention back to his meal, but he couldn't stop staring. It was odd enough that the Chamsky brat was in the same area of town, but what was Lamone doing talking to her again? And where had he gone? One moment they were talking, the next a clanging carriage skidded around the corner and the man disappeared. It didn't matter. They were in town, and he could avoid them. He'd managed to secure lodging easily enough. Now he just needed to wait until the Chamskys left town, and he would book his own transportation to California. He knew where they were going, so that wouldn't be a surprise. The surprise would be on them when he got there. Still, what to do? He'd spent so much time avoiding them on the train, just trying to stay fed, that he hadn't come up with a plan yet on what to do once they were all in California. He had time on his side, though. Getting to St. Louis had been a quick trip by rail. Getting over the Rocky Mountains would be another story altogether. He left $1 on the table and watched across the street. The girl had to be still in the store. A small crowd of people hid his entry into the street, and soon enough he made his way back to the area of his room. Unlike when he'd gotten off the train, only one boy approached him begging for money. He'd rented a room from a widow. He forgot her name already, but he'd be able to make sweet talk with her later and find out where to procure transportation. He would again give the Chamskys a head start, and hopefully they would maintain that head start, so they wouldn't be bumping into each other along the way. Perhaps he'd even take the long way around, south of the Rocky Mountains, and avoid them altogether. The way would be easier, and even though it wasn't the right time of year, it would be good to avoid any chance of snow. He laid on the bed and stared at the ceiling for several minutes. The train ride had been different. There he could just sit and try to enjoy the trip while avoiding getting seen. Now that he was in a room, on a bed, with nothing to do, he felt the urge to do something, anything. He wondered if he could take a job doing something and perhaps earn a few dollars while he waited. No sense on just lying around waiting for events to happen. Sitting up, he looked around the windowless room. He wasn't used to sitting still for long periods of time. He needed to get up and do something. The only thing he ever did in his apartment in New York was sleep. The rest of the time he was either working or found other things to do around town. Even though there was a chance he'd run into two people he'd rather not run into, he had to get out of the room. He'd return when sleep demanded it of him. The train arrived in the afternoon, and with the longer days of summer upon them, the sun still had not gone down. Finding entertainment in town shouldn't be very difficult. Reginald didn't drink and had no use for fighting, but he enjoyed music a great deal. "Excuse me, sir. Do you know where I can find some entertainment for the evening?" "I say, I'm with my wife. How dare you ask me something like that? I think you misunderstand me. I'm looking for a theater or music hall." The man replaced his hat, but still scrunched up his face. "Head over to the west side of town. They usually have a play or two, and with the fields extending off towards the sunset, I suspect it'll be a good display tonight." Reginald nodded his head. The man looked as if he waited for Reginald to say something, but instead his wife pulled him away. Looking to the sky to get his bearings, Reginald headed for the west side of town. Even though he'd only had the one encounter prior to leaving New York, he still avoided any police he saw. He gave an especially wide berth to any mounted police, though he did stop and watch a troop of soldiers riding through town. Something about their presence reminded him just how close to the wilds they were. Beyond this city, little would be found until they reached California. Nothing more than outposts and barter towns. One of the mounted soldiers pulled a cart with a tarp over it. Reginald very much would like to know what they had under there. Most likely a weapon to use against the natives should they ride into town and cause trouble. Perhaps they were taking it out into the countryside to deal with an uprising. Suddenly the prospect of entertainment didn't hold Reginald's attention as much as finding out what lay under that tarp. He changed direction, narrowly avoiding colliding with a man wearing a baggy brown suit and a bowler carrying some machine, and following the soldiers. Perhaps if he engaged them in conversation, they might let slip what they had with them. Only two of them looked old enough to keep their mouths shut, but a little drink would loosen their lips. "Make way! Make way!" A giant of a man ran down the middle of the street, followed by a mounted officer. "Move it! Make way!" The officer, followed by 3 officers on foot, nearly ran over Reginald as the giant went around and the horse tried to cut him off, trapping Reginald in the middle. He ducked down and put his hands over his head, only to be knocked over by the 3 officers. They all rolled up into a ball. Never in one day had he been involved with so much going on as this. New Yorkers did their best to keep their business like this off the streets. Apparently St. Louis was filled with far too many characters. A path cleared behind the giant as he ran, allowing the mounted officer an easy time chasing him. Reginald cursed and unrolled himself from the tangle of officers. Each apologized, tipped their hat, and continued the pursuit. He took a moment to brush the dust off his coat and trousers. Looking up the road, the soldiers had disappeared into the crowd. Probably around a corner or two. He'd have to keep an eye out for them while he made his way about town. For now, he'd go in search of that entertainment he'd been looking out for. No sense in letting a beautiful evening go to waste. A clock chimed somewhere in the distance, signaling 5 o'clock, and with a couple of hours before sundown, the performance, as the suspicious gentleman suggested earlier, should be outstanding. No sooner had he taken a step, and a boy, being chased by an older boy, bumped into him. Reginald grabbed the boy's collar and tried to pull him in. The kid spun and shouted, "I'm sorry, mister," and pulled himself free, and continued his run. Reginald, bumped by the older and far larger boy, caught a glimpse of something in the smaller boy's hand. A wallet. His wallet. These kids were from a small town. Reginald grew up in New York and knew such tricks. He also wouldn't allow them to get away with a goodly piece of his money. If the boy knew how much money was in the wallet, he'd know that the owner wouldn't give up pursuit easily. Reginald took up the chase. It made her feel important to have things delivered to their hotel. She felt bad about spending nearly $10 on herself when they still had so far to go, but she was certain that her father still had at least $200 left. He'd spent a good amount of money on books and little else. The rest had gone to their transportation. Her father had gone off to meet with the train engineers. He took a lot of pride in his work and rarely got the opportunity to talk with anyone that actually used his inventions. Even though this meant she would eventually eat dinner alone, had spent money on what they could have used for getting to California, she couldn't be happier that her father was finally not stuck in a room with his nose in a book or drawing up more blueprints for machinery. The only thing she didn't want was another encounter with Mr. Lamone. She didn't like the man. Everything he said and the way he acted just didn't add up. But a nagging in the back of her mind told her that he would show up when she least expected it, even though she'd been ready for him the last time. Something told her he wouldn't show up when she was at her best. After an hour of looking at menus posted on blackboards outside of restaurants, and being hassled by men and women trying to get her to inside to eat the best food in St. Louis, she finally settled on an Italian cafe. It reminded her of home, and right then she needed a little bit of home. Food came, but she found it difficult to eat. As much as the restaurant reminded her of home, it made her miss home more than she could have imagined. She paid and thought she might head back to the hotel and maybe just lie down and cry herself to sleep before her father got back. At least he was having a good time on his trip. The street signs didn't look familiar as she looked around. Her mind had been so caught up thinking about home that she didn't even remember leaving the restaurant. Did she finish her food? Had she left a tip? She must have paid or they wouldn't have let her leave. She was a young girl in a strange town. She needed to keep her wits about her. "Hey, little girl, over here." The voice came from a dark alleyway. The sun had gone down, and she could just make out a formless shape. A low, resonant voice that didn't sound threatening, but why would it be calling to her? "I'm not little." Abigail turned to walk away. "Please, I need some assistance. Perhaps we could help each other out." "I'm on the street and you're hiding in an alleyway. This isn't a way to start a conversation." Again she started to walk away. "I don't have anyone I can trust. Please, help me." Isn't that just how someone trying to kidnap you would act? Trustworthy or needy? One of her friends had gotten kidnapped back home, and no one ever heard from her again. If Abigail allowed herself to get into a situation she couldn't get out of, it would devastate her father. That was the last thing she wanted. "I mean you no harm. I got myself into a spot of trouble and require a little help getting out of it is all. I will return the favor in any way I can." "Let's, just for the sake of argument, assume you're not going to kidnap me and kill me, or worse. What makes you think I'll help you? I don't know you. You don't know that I'm not with the police, and I may just turn you in. How do you know that I'm not the one you should be afraid of?" "I saw you and your father get off the train this afternoon. I saw the way you looked at him when he walked away. I know you're new in town, and you care about your father. Knowing that, I know I can trust you." "So how do I know I can trust you? You've obviously been stalking me all day." "That's not true. It's just chance that brought us together. I had stowed away in the train. I rode on top, and when everyone had gotten off the train, I took my chance to get off. Unfortunately, someone spotted me, and the police has been after me all day. I just need a place to hide for the evening so I can rest and get out into town in the morning." She had to think about that for a minute. "Are you asking to share the hotel room my father and I have?" The stranger didn't say anything. The silence said everything. The person had to be a criminal just waiting for her to make a wrong move, and he'd pounce on her, rob her and her father, and be off with all of their belongings. They'd be stranded in St. Louis. No. For the third time she started to leave. "I can pay you. I don't want to impose, but my appearance makes it difficult for me to get around town." "So what you're asking is for me to aid a criminal, get around town, and possibly get myself into trouble? You're sure to ask a lot." A massive hand emerged from the shadows, holding out a $5 bill. Abigail repressed a gasp, and she leaned back slightly. It took her a moment to regain her composure. "And why didn't you use that to purchase fare on the train rather than stow away?" The man stood up, and it became readily apparent why he hadn't purchased fare. The little punks had led a merry chase, but they hadn't accounted for the fact that Reginald could run after them all day. Despite his wiry frame, he could swing a hammer for hours and run for days. They wouldn't get away without feeling his wrath. The older boy turned around, after circling through the town for hours, and held up his fists. The boy knew he would take a beating, even though he'd come out of the scuffle for the worse. His partner would be able to get away. Reginald wasn't falling for this trick. Puffing and panting, the boy had planted his feet to prepare to defend himself. "You chose the wrong person to rob this day." He dropped his shoulder and plowed into the boy, knocking him over. Now nothing hindered his view of the smaller boy. If only the smaller boy had been anywhere in sight. Spinning around, he strode back to the bigger boy, and before he could get to his feet, a kick put the boy back in the dirt. Reginald had a boot on the boy's head. "Where did your partner go?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Where? Don't make me ask again." "I don't—" Reginald delivered a kick to the boy's ribs. "Leave my brother alone!" Something hit Reginald in the head. His hand reactively snapped up to feel the point of pain. It came away covered in blood. He forced his foot down harder on the boy's head. "If you want to do something for your brother, come down here and give me my wallet back. And it had better have all of its contents, or your brother here will have a lot more to worry about than my boot. Throw something else, and you'll regret it. It's getting dark, so I suggest you make it quick, boy." Surprisingly, the boy returned quickly. Reginald, his foot still on the older brother's head, snatched the wallet from the younger, and began counting the money inside. "It's all there. I didn't take nothing. Now get off my brother." The impetuous lad even dared to push Reginald in an effort to get him to move. "I will move when I'm satisfied that I have my property back, boy. Don't get so anxious." "Yeah, well, we need to eat, so let him up so we can get some money for food. I'm hungry." Reginald finally sized up the younger brother. Neither he nor his older brother looked like they'd been lacking for food. Quite the contrary, they both looked hearty and well fed. If anything, it should be the older boy who felt hungry. "Why are you busy stealing instead of working? Surely the two of you can find good work." Reginald finally took his foot off the older boy's head. "Come on, Jess, let's go." The younger boy pulled on his brother's jacket, not taking his eyes off of Reginald. Jess stood and shrugged off his brother, and dusted himself off and smoothed out his hair. "You didn't need to stand on my head like that." Satisfied that his money was in his wallet, Reginald put it back inside his coat pocket. "Where are your parents?" "Jess, let's go. I'm hungry." "We don't got no parents. You got your wallet. You ain't gonna call the police on me and Jax or nothing, are you?" "We'll have to see about that. First, I want some answers." Reginald had been busy seeking entertainment. What better entertainment than to spring these two ruffians on Champsky and his kid? He didn't want to halt their progress. No one would know if something happened here in St. Louis, but he could make their trip a little more uncomfortable. "First, where are your parents?" Jess sniffed. "We don't got no parents. What of it? Everyone got parents where you come from?" In fact, Reginald didn't have parents either. He'd been raised in an orphanage, and it was his skill with large machinery that helped him get out. He'd never resorted to common thievery like these two had. Even though he didn't care for their methods for taking care of themselves, they did have a certain gumption that couldn't go unrewarded. "How long have the two of you been on the streets? You don't look like it's been long. I don't see holes in your clothes, and you certainly don't look like you've missed more than a meal or two." Jax dug his toe into the dirt. "They shut down the orphanage a couple weeks back. Threw the lot of us out. Me and Jess here, we're just making good on what we know best. The rest are all out there begging. It's pitiful. Me and Jess won't do no begging. This building don't have no use, and no one lives here, so we figure it's ours fair enough." Their grammar needed some improvement, but at least the two had some kind of work ethic and wouldn't stand for a handout. No wonder they were hungry. A couple weeks on the street, but at least they'd managed to find a place to live and were bringing in money. Strange that the police hadn't caught them yet. The older boy, probably 15 and built like a locomotive, was slow both physically and mentally. Strong, though. On the other hand, the younger one proved to be quite fast, but just not fast enough, either through wits or speed. "If the two of you need money, I have a job for you. It'll be legitimate work and not easy. I'll pay each of you $2. We don't do nothing for less than 10. Reginald liked Jax more and more each time the kid opened his mouth. $5 each is far too expensive for what I need you to do. I'll pay a total of 5. Jax pulled Jess down and whispered in his ear, "No deal, mister. 10 or we walk. There's enough suckers out there that don't watch their wallets. You need something done more than we need to do it. $10. I could call an officer right now and have you hauled away. Don't get smart with me. You'll take $6 and like it." Jack spit in his hand and held it out. Reginald did likewise.